So what today I will take? I will take modern age में जो Edwardian poetry, Georgian poetry, poetry between two world war and some other moments I will cover. And let me share the PDF file. Yeah, already I have done this point कि modern age क्या है, उसकी characteristics क्या है. I have also done this thing. Modern poetry. Yeah, poetry between two world war. If the question come, if the short question come, or any long question come, ki poetry between two world war, then how you have to write and which poem you have to mention and which work of the poet you have to mention. So remember that there are two significant points, and what are those points? Poetry between two world wars. Whenever I talk about poetry between two world wars, you will come to know two world wars. It means that after 1918 and before 1939. चूंकि first world war it took place in 1918 and in 1914 and it went on into 1918. So from 1914 to 1918, from 1914 to 1918 यू विल कम टू नो वो चीज बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रहा है कि 1914 से लेकर 1918 ईस्वी तक का जो टाइम था या जो पीरियड था दैट इज नोन एज द फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर 1914 to 1918. But there is another important point, that is what ki before 1939. Do you find any change? Because Second World War starts from 1939 to 1945. So the topic is what? The topic is poetry between the two world wars, दो world war के बीच में. Especially when I say poetry between two world war, it means that after the First World War and before starting the Second World War. And when I talk about after the First World War, they remember that कि First World War was the ground war. पहला वर्ल्ड वॉर जो था वो ग्राउंड वॉर था. इट वाज फॉट ऑन लैंड या इट वाज फॉट ऑन अर्थ. बट द सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर वाज द एरी वॉर जो हवा में लड़ा गया था. So in this situation you will come to know the changes, and in this situation you will come to know the havoc, the destruction, devastation brought by First World War or Second World. लेकिन युद्ध के बाद की जो जिंदगी है उसमें क्या परिवर्तन आया, व्हाट द चेंजेस केम एंड हाउ दोज एक्सपीरियंसेस हैव बीन डील्ड बाय द पोएट, it's a very significant point which we have to discuss. So I'm going to take poetry between two world wars, and you find here the years between two world wars, 1919 1939.
Exactly, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, so you find that what you find, yeah, are you getting my voice? किसी को कोई दिक्कत तो नहीं है?
Yes, sir. Good
No,
evening,
sir.
sir.
Okay, good evening. So I was telling you when I talk about the two world wars, yeah, poetry between two world wars, first you have to keep in your mind this particular date. Ki after ending the First World War, the First World War came to end in 1918 and the Second World War started in 1939. Between these two wars, the period is from 1919 to 1935. What the changes came, what the changes took place in literature, that is significant point which we have to remember. When you talk about especially key poetry between two world war, then first I would like to tell you, you have to remember that going to talk about war poets. Yeah, either I'm going to tell about T.S. Eliot or W.B. Yeats. आपको ये ध्यान में रखना है कि जब भी पोइट्री बिटवीन टू वर्ल्ड वार की बात होगी, या तो आपको वार पोएट नजर आते हैं या तो आपको कौन नजर आएगा, either you find T.S. Eliot or you find whom or you find W.B. Yeats. It means that whenever you write a question on poetry between two world war, you have to keep in your mind And what was the trench poetry? T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. These two important poets, and trench poetry means poets who were the soldier as well as poet. कुछ पोएट्स ऐसे थे जो सोल्जर्स भी थे. दे पार्टिसिपेटेड इन द फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर. दे गॉट द फर्स्ट हैंड एक्सपीरियंस ऑफ द वॉर. Once one you can say on one hand they use bullet and gun, and on the other hand they use the pen to express their thought. So whenever I talk about these poets, there are some important names. And number one, Siegfried Sezan, Siege, Siege, Fried, Siegfried Sezan. There is a name. And the second name was Rupert Brooke, and the third name was Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is a very important poet, especially poetry between two world wars. And the what I would not like to say ki the prominent poet, but I would like to say the most popular poet, that was T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. So you don't have to miss these two poets. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, it came in 1922, and W.B. Yeats composed a beautiful poem, The Second Coming, that came in 1920. So what I want to say, 1920 or 1922, it means that we are talking about poetry between two world wars. So when you go, the years between two world wars witnessed prolific poetic activity. This is a very significant point. Prolific poetic activity. It means that during these days, yeah, it means that between two world wars, we find a lot of changes in the field of poetry, prolific poetic activity. Already I explained, already I told, the it was expected that poetry will die with the death of tension. Yeah, poetry will die with tension. As tension die, poetry will die. It was said in 1892. It was said that poetry will die. But you will come to know modern age is remarkable for the revival of poetry and drama. Modern age is remarkable for the revival of poetry and drama. Poetry didn't die, but poetry was revived. Poetry was revived. So you find the years between two world wars, 1919 to 1935, witnessed prolific poetic activity. It was a period when tradition and innovation went side by side. You find that key two things you find in poetry. Number one, tradition, and number two, innovation. Now you can say key, how do you find tradition and how do you find innovation? You find innovation because of the use of uh, free words. Use of free words instead of blank words. It was a great achievement of modern poets. And other points, even you can just mention there, that was another innovation, was the innovation of the poetry became complex. And poetry, just we find something, problems or other things based on the ground of reality, physical, mental, spiritual, psychological themes have been taken in the poem. And other significant point was what? Other significant point was the uh, post-World War experiences. Post-World War experiences, जो life था, that life was depicted, that life was admired. So we find these things. Here I just want to say, whenever I talk with you, yeah, whenever I share anything with you, just I want to tell you what just I want to tell you two are very important points which we have to keep in our mind. And what are those? Number one, we all have to go that the age was remarkable for tradition, the age was remarkable for innovation, and these two things went side by side. You can just find the use of image, you can find the use of symbol, you can find the use of myth, you can find the use of irony, you can find the use of allusions, you can find the use of references, you can find interior monologue, you can just find something free verse, you can just find such type of culture, especially related to the people of middle class, the degradation of the moral values. So not only thematically but also technically, you find both the use of innovation and tradition in poetry, especially after First World War. When you go with the poem The Second Coming, composed by W.B. Yeats, when you go with the poem The Wasteland, composed by T.S. Eliot, then you come to know these things. And I don't think I need to explain in a very detailed way, because already I told you how do you find these things. So you have to remember that key these things we find, and when side by side in the direction of innovation, we can in the direction of innovation we can find such groups as imagist, misuse of image, symbolist, use of symbols, surrealists, working, whereas we also find some traditional fighting, a last ditch battle, a last ditch battle against the forces of change. Except it, we also find the changes which were occurring, the changes which were taking place. There were some people who opposed these changes, who wrote against these changes in their poem. So, this is the point. However, most of the poets of the age combined tradition and innovation, and even the most daring innovators did not or could not cut at the root of the essential continuity of English poetry. So, whenever you write, you have to tell that the poetry between two world war, it was significant, not for just witnessing prolific poetic activity. Number one point, it was significant for witnessing prolific poetic activity. Number two point, it was a period when tradition and innovation went side by side. Number third point, key, what the innovation and tradition do you find? In innovation, you find use of image, use of symbol, use of allusions, references. You find abrupt starting of the poem, interior monologue form, use of free verse. These things you find. So these are the outer form of the poem. These are the outer form of the poem. Basis of these things, you will able to understand the beauty of the poem, how the poems were composed, how the poems have been written, how the poems have been presented. So these things, you find these things. Now, after it, you find tradition. When I talk about tradition, it means that we find some lyric poems also in which the you can say devastation, destruction, havoc, chaotic situation of World War, especially of First World War, and after the ending of the First World War, yeah, after the overing of the First World War, the life was turning day by day. Those experiences were also shared or painted or depicted. So these things, there were some people who were against these changes. They wrote openly, but what happened? We find these things, and that was also especially we can see in the poem of T.S. Eliot, and one of his critical essay, that was what, that was tradition and the individual talent. There he also wrote a tradition and the individual talent, and even in one of his critical essay, metaphysical poets, he admires John Donne and other poets. So these things you can. So you have to just tell these characteristics means यहाँ से लेकर यहाँ तक. After it, you have to go with what? After it, you have to go with uh, the particular concept. That is what. After it, you have to go with this example, the wasteland, and W.B. Yeats, the second coming. You have to mention, and you have also to talk about ceasefire Simpson. You have to talk about Rupert Brooke. Talk about another poet that is Will, and especially Dulce et decorum est. So you will. And I already I have explained automatic writing, high modernism, but it's here again. I would like to go with you. What do you mean? What do you mean by automatic writing? What do you mean by high modernism? Automatic writing that has been freed from control means the writing which has been freed from control, that was not controlled by any one year by any, you can say, strict norms, rules or regulation. There were some poets who believed in innovation. There were some poets who brought some changes. So type of writing is known automatic writing, self-made writing. Self-made writing. They were not the imitator. They were not the blind supporter. They were not the follower. If they believe that I have to write this way, I believe in this doctrine. I believe in this literary principle. So they followed that, and the same pattern they adopted, and they started to write. This is why I'm using the word innovation. Writing that has been freed from challenge by the conscious, purposive mind and other modes of language that achieved their effects by violating the norms of standard English syntax, especially Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Virginia Woolf came in the category of automatic writing. If you remember these names, you will be able to understand why automatic writing and how automatic writing created principle, a self-created pattern which they followed to compose the poem. They were not under the force of any strict norms. Yes, no one forced them that you have to write this way, you have to write that way, as we find in the age of Alexander Pope. Basically, that time one has to follow heroic couplet, one has to follow some strict norms, so they can't violate that thing. But here you find they were free, and freely they wrote whatever they think, whatever the point came in their minds. Now that is the concept of the automatic writing. Just I want to know your response. Are you getting it? Can anyone?
Clear.
Okay, okay. Now you find the second point, and what is that? High modernism. Already I said that this phrase is very important, and most probably I expect that you will give this question in means high modernism is short answer type question. And when I talk about high modernism, that is especially a particular date, that is 1922, क्योंकि इस समय दो तीन वर्क आए थे साथ में पब्लिश हुए थे, तो मॉडर्निज्म के बाद या मॉडर्निज्म या जो मॉडर्न पीरियड है उसमें एक शॉर्ट पीरियड को हाई मॉडर्निज्म कहा जाता है, एंड द डेट वाज 1922. Literary historians locate the beginning of the modernist revolt as far as 1890. This is a very important point. Ki 1880-90, the modern age started. It is said that the last decade of the Victorian age was important, and in the last decade, we find that the modern age is started. But most agree that what is called high modern, there is another significant point, and what was that? Most agree that what is called high modernism marked by an unexampled scope and rapidity of change. This is a very significant point. And what is that? He, the rapidity and change that took place, rapidity and change that took place, and that rapidity and change you will come to. It happened in 1922. So that is the exact date which you find high modernism marked by an unexampled scope and rapidity of change came after the First World War, especially in literature. You find in literature you see, and what was that? That was the use of symbol, the use of allusions, the use of myth, the use of indirect way of saying, especially the objective correlative, unification of sensibility, and so many movements you find that was these poets were influenced. So those techniques, so those things were adopted in the poem. It was used there. Especially, it was used by whom? It was used by James Joyce in Ulysses. It was used by T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. It was used by Virginia Woolf in Jacob's Room. And these three prominent literary pieces came in 1922. This is why whatever the changes took place, change took place, uh, it reflected in 1920 among these works. This is why the age is the particular 1922 has been addressed as high modernism. So, if any question comes related to high modernism, you can now write down. And this is a very important question, is stream of consciousness technique. A very important question. Here again, I have to tell you, whenever you go, the phrase used by William James in his Principles of Psychology, you have to write this particular pattern the way I have written. The phrase was used by whom? It was used by William James in his book Principles of Psychology to describe unbroken flow of perceptions, memories, thoughts and feelings in the waking mind. जब इंसान जागता रहता है, जब इंसान कॉन्शियस लेवल पर होता है, जागते हुए में भी वह क्या करता है, वह कुछ चीजें सोचता रहता है, उसके दिमाग में कुछ ना कुछ चीजें चलती रहती है। तो जो अनब्रोकन फ्लो है, जो बगैर रुके हुए, बगैर टूटे हुए जो विचारों का प्रवाह है, अनब्रोकन फ्लो ऑफ परसेप्शंस, उसका जो है, जो मेमोरीज है, जो थॉट्स है एंड फीलिंग्स है इन द वेकिंग माइंड, when these things have been depicted, then that technique is known as stream of consciousness technique. It has since been adopted to describe a narrative method in modern fiction. कह रहे इसको तब से यूज किया गया है एक नैरेटिव मेथड के रूप में, किसमें? मॉडर्न फिक्शन में. So you find that what? You find that it has since been adopted, तब से इसको adopt किया गया है. It has since been adopted to describe करने के लिए for what? A narrative method in modern fiction में long passage of introspection, long passage of introspection in which the narrator records in detail what passes through a character's awareness are found in knowledge from Samuel Richardson to Henry James. Yeah, we find it. This technique has been used by Dorothy Richardson in Pilgrimage, Virginia Woolf in Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, James Joyce in Ulysses, William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury. So you have to remember and you have to write ki, what do you mean by stream of consciousness technique? The phrase stream of consciousness refers to unbroken flow of perceptions, memories, thoughts, and feelings in the waking mind of a character. This technique was first, you can say, used by William James in his book Principles of Psychology, which came in 1890. Was adopted by
सर वॉइस नहीं आ रही।
आई थिंक यू आर गेटिंग माई वॉइस, आवाज जा रही है?
यस सर, अब आ रही है सर।
ओके ओके ओके। So you will come to know what you will come to know कि this technique has been used by Dorothy Wordsworth या उनका, तो in this way you will be able to understand what you have to do, how you have to do. I think now you are in position to understand what I want to say. Stream of consciousness technique, and these things you will be able to understand. So one thing I would like to tell you, remember that that is what interior monologue. Interior monologue. When I talk about interior monologue, this question has also been asked by Siaram ji. He said, what is the difference between stream of consciousness technique and interior monologue, and how do we find these things? So there is a point which we can understand. These are very significant points which I am discussing with you, because in short answer type questions, inshallah, you will get these things. Interior monologue. The phrase refers to denote all the diverse means implied by the authors to communicate the total and process of consciousness. This is a very, the phrase refers to denote all the diverse means, जितना भी diverse means are implied by the authors for what? To communicate the total state, to communicate the total state and process of consciousness which undertake to present the reader the force and rhythm of consciousness precisely as it occurs in a character's mind. In interior monologue, the author does not intervene as describer, guide, or commentator. ध्यान में रहेगा, in interior monologue, the author does not intervene as describer, guide or commentator. इंटीरियर मोनोलॉग में आथर का कोई भी रोल नहीं होगा। जब भी इंटीरियर मोनोलॉग की बात आएगी तो यू विल फाइंड एनी third character. For example, in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, you find a character Prufrock. So, what the poet wants to tell, yeah, what the poet wants to describe, what the poet wants to unfold, he unfolds, he tells, he describes with the help of an invented character, that is Prufrock. There is no intervention of T.S. Eliot. You don't find T.S. Eliot in the poem, but instead of T.S. Eliot, you find Eliot has invented a character, that is Alfred Prufrock. And what Prufrock thinks, what is occurring within the heart of Prufrock, what is occurring within the mind of Prufrock. Prufrock is telling that thing. Prufrock, who is a mentally sick character. He, if I use the word, that he is an aged character who wants to propose some girl, but he does not have potency to propose whom he likes. This is why we find lack of communication, we find infatuation, we find lust and passion, we find so many things there. So, what I want to say, what I want to tell you, whenever either you and I go, always take this point and you can explain these points very well. बहुत अच्छे ढंग से आप इन सब चीजों को explain कर सकते हैं या समझ सकते हैं कि what I want. So, again, I would like to say कि the phrase refers to denote all the diverse means, all the diverse means, जितना भी diverse means है, उन सबको जो है explain करने के लिए होता है, implied by others to communicate the total state. The total state means what's your state? What's your state means कि what you are at inner level. What do you think? What is occurring within your heart? What is occurring within your mind? That particular perception, that particular thought, that particular notion, ideas of a character is in is communicated, is told, is presented, but author doesn't intervene. And you will come to know which undertake to present to the reader the force and rhythm of consciousness precisely as it occurs in a character's mind, as it occurs in a character's. That is the point. In interior monologue, you have to remember only this thing. Interior monologue is a literary device by which the author becomes able to present what is occurring within the character, within the mind of a character. What does he think? What the notion he has, what the perception he has, he here presents, and the author doesn't intervene. सबसे बड़ी चीज है कि the poet or the author doesn't intervene. Already I gave you the example, uh, love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I request it to all of you, if you have time, whenever you go in the examination, before appearing in the examination, you have to cover T.S. Eliot's Love Song of Childhood to Frog. You have also to cover The Wasteland. If you have time, you can just go with these two things, because these two things are very important in my view. Even uh, if you go with Arms and the Man, that is highly significant. If you go with Macbeth and Othello, I'm not saying all the work. To some extent you have to prepare for these things. Macbeth you have read Arms and the Man, you have read Othello, you have read As You Like It, or The Merchant of Venice. These plays you have to come with the beauty of these plays, especially uh, if I say summary, if I say some characters, if you find any particular question related to these works, you will be able to explain that. You will be to explain. Now I will take this particular portion, Edwardian poetry. After it, I will conclude this lecture and meet you tomorrow. Poetry after 1900 to 1920. When I talk about the Edwardian poetry, तो उसका जो पीरियड है उसमें बता रहे हैं कि 1900 से लेकर 1922 तक का जो पीरियड है इज आफ्टर रेड अंडर टू हेड्स, एडवर्डियन एंड जॉर्जियन. एडवर्डियन और जॉर्जियन के अंतर्गत आता है. कौन सी पोइट्री? 1900 से लेकर 1922 तक जो पोइट्री लिखी गई है, इट इज सेड दैट इट कम्स अंडर टू हेड्स, एडवर्डियन एंड जॉर्जियन. Though there is considerable overlap between the two, though there is considerable overlap between the two. Features of Edwardian and Georgian poetry rooted in local and regional context. You don't have to forget, if it comes to write a note on Edwardian poetry, these 5 points you have to learn. Number one, rooted in local and regional context, especially rural themes. जो थीम लिया गया था वो कौन सा था? रूरल थीम था, और उसमें रीजनल कॉन्टेक्स्ट या लोकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट को लेकर के बात की गई थी. यूज्ड एग्रेरियन इमेजरी, खेती से संबंधित इमेज को या उन चीजों को लेकर के, एंड डिटेल्ड लोकल लैंडस्केप जस्ट एज यू फाइंड इन द रीजनल नॉवेल, दैट इज द नॉवेल, बट स्पेशली in the poem of Hardy, even you can just see this type of thing. Yeah, afterwards, Darkling Thrust, and other poems you find heavily sentimental, aimed to speak realistically about everyday life, and war poetry. So when I talk about Edwardian poetry, what thing we find? We find war, we find realistic about everyday life, we find sentiment, we find agrarian imagery, we find rural themes, we find regional or local setting. These things we find. So when you go with these points, what I want to say, just keep in your mind. These are the means always the question come कि write a note on Edwardian poetry, तो short question sometimes come. अगर कोई बड़ा भी आ जाता है तो इससे कोई बड़ी चीज नहीं है. Edward, but these 5 points you don't have to forget, and you have to tell the duration key from 1900 to 1920. It is said that key the poetry is after read under two heads, Edwardian and Georgian. Now एडवर्डियन पोएट्स कौन कौन से? क्रिटिक केनेथ मिलर एक क्रिटिक है, जिनका नाम केनेथ मिलार्ड है, और केनेथ मिलार्ड ने एक कलेक्शन ऑफ द पोयम, तो एडवर्डियन जो पोइट्री थी उसके ऊपर उन्होंने एक एडिटेड बुक निकाला था जिसका नाम ही रखा गया था एडवर्डियन पोइट्री। इट मीन्स दैट कि द क्रेडिट गोज टू हुम, द क्रेडिट गोज टू क्रिटिक केनेथ मिलार्ड। इन एडवर्डियन पोइट्री लिस्ट 7 पोएट्स अंडर एडवर्डियन पोइट्री, जिसमें कौन कौन से हैं? हाउसमैन है, हेनरी न्यूबोल्ट है, हाउसमैन हेनरी न्यूबोल्ट, जॉन मैसफील्ड, थॉमस हार्डी, एडवर्ड थॉमस, जॉन डेविडसन एंड रूपर्ट ब्रूक। Figures like John Masefield wrote across my voice? हेलो, हेलो, आवाज जा रही है मेरी?
हाँ सर अब आ रही है।
Okay. Yeah, please mute, please mute. So we are getting that key figures like John Masefield wrote across both the Edwardian and Georgian periods while also being by the first moderns. The poets are concerned with the fast disappearing values. सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट चीज था, जितने भी पोएट्स ने ये लिखा वो किसके बारे में लिखते थे? फास्ट डिसअपियरिंग वैल्यूज, जो वैल्यूज विक्टोरियन एज का था, दैट वाज डिसअपियरिंग वेरी फास्ट, और खासकर ओल्ड इंग्लैंड का इन द एज ऑफ मॉडर्नाइजेशन एंड वॉर। और उन्होंने वॉर को भी लेके बात किया, फर्स्ट द बोर वॉर बिटवीन 1899 एंड 1902 एंड लेटर वर्ल्ड वॉर फर्स्ट। तो एडवर्डियन पोएट्स ने जिस थीम को लेकर के लिखा, फास्ट डिसअपियरिंग वैल्यूज ऑफ ओल्ड इंग्लैंड, मॉडर्नाइजेशन को लेकर के, वार को लेकर के एंड लेटर वर्ल्ड वॉर फर्स्ट को लेकर के, देयर इज अ सेंस ऑफ नॉस्टैल्जिया इन दीज वर्क्स। कह रहे हैं कि उनके अपने वर्क्स में नॉस्टैल्जिया नजर आता है। नॉस्टैल्जिया का मतलब होता है कि पास्ट के प्रति अट्रैक्टिव होना। पास्ट ऑलवेज हर्ट यू, पास्ट ऑलवेज कम्स इन योर लाइफ। in these works. The British Empire and expansion also constitute, जो ब्रिटिश साम्राज्य का फैलाव था वो भी चीजें उनकी थीम में रहा है. थॉमस हार्डी known more for his fiction wrote some war poetry. थॉमस हार्डी जो कि फिक्शन के नाम से जाने जाते हैं, जो एक एडवर्डियन पोएट के बेहतरीन पोएट थे, उन्होंने ड्रमर हाज नाम का पोएम लिखा जिसमें उन्होंने एक सैनिक को जो दम तोड़ रहा है, लड़ रहा है, उसकी लाइफ को लेकर उन्होंने बताया. तो यू विल कम टू नो कि आज हम यहीं पे एडवर्डियन पोइट्री को लेकर के मैंने कहा था, बात किया था. सो आई हैव डन एडवर्डियन पोइट्री, आई हैव डन स्ट्रीम ऑफ कॉन्शियसनेस, इंटीरियर मोनोलॉग, हाई मॉडर्निज्म, ऑटोमेटिक राइटिंग, पोइट्री बिटवीन these two worlds I have done, and just meet you tomorrow. Meet you tomorrow. If you have any doubt, you have just send me in WhatsApp group because I feel too tired. Okay.